Hello everybody, my name is Sail with the Modern DIY, and today we are going to be talking about how to prep a live edge burl slab. Before me you'll see that I have a maple slab with a pretty interesting burl edge to it, as well as lots of tie green and curl throughout the edges. The tools that we're going to need for this project, at least this step of it, are going to be quite simple. We're going to need a chisel. I have a 1/2 inch here, but you can use a 1/4 inch. That's what I'd recommend for these knot areas. It's going to be a lot sturdier. You're also going to need a pick of some sort. I have glass-filled nylon, like used for auto body work, but I would recommend that you get a metal one. Past that, we're also going to need a drill and drill brush or wire wheel attachment, a file, not a rasp, a file. And if you want to get fancy towards the end of this section of the project, then a saw to square up the edges will be great. Now right here you'll see that I'm just more or less twisting and working around the chisel to kind of break up those knots. And that's because that's pretty much the process. Even here on the edge, I'm just working it in between the edge of the wood and the beginning of the bark. You push, you pry, you twist, and do whatever it takes really to get the bark off. Once the major pieces are off, and you're left with the finer stuff that's just in between the peaks and valleys, that's where the pick's going to come in a lot of handy, as well as the drill brush, because we don't want to destroy the character of the peaks and valleys. We want to let it maintain as much of that irregularity and uniqueness as possible. That's why we use these kind of slabs and pick them, because they're pretty, there's nothing like them, and at the end of the day, I mean, that's kind of what the market is demanding right now as far as these things go. In a second here, you'll see that I switched to the drill brush, and that's mainly because once the bark is off here, this thick portion, we're going to be left with what's called the cambium layer, and that is the layer in between the bark and the actual wood itself. In order to get a good connection of finish to wood, we need that off. So I have a 120 grit wheel here, and hindsight being what it is, I should have used the 60 grit at first, but I thought this was going to be enough for the fine layer of cambium. With this, we are just going to hit it in as many angles and variations of twist as possible to get as much of that cambium layer and any residual bark and stuff like that out. Like I mentioned, we want to have as smooth of a surface as possible, wood-wise, not necessarily the irregularities of the burl, to get that finish on there and to make it look nice. Now, with this wheel, you can take it up to the 220 grit one, but it's not really going to be necessary because we're not setting on anything on there and it's jagged as is. Right here, I'm switching over to a half moon rasp. Not rasp, but file. A rasp is going to be much too aggressive for this. It's going to leave dark, shadowy valleys from the aggressive tooth pattern. And so this file is just going to take the point off some of those higher portions of the burl. That way, if you grab it, bump into it, drop it on your foot or something, it's not going to draw blood or cause any real pain. Here you'll see that I am taking it that step further for this prep that I mentioned. I am squaring up a straight edge so I can cut off this raw saw mark from milling. You don't have to do this right here. As a matter of fact, I wouldn't recommend that you do this early in the prep work stage. This is more or less the second part of it, the squaring up and flattening. But I had the camera here and I had the saw out, so I figured why not. You don't have to have a necessarily saw fence or anything like that to do this. All you need is a straight edge. You can clamp a pipe down or a ruler or something, or if you have a really steady hand, just freehand it. If you have access to a jointer and a planer, chop saw, stuff like that, of course, use it. It's going to make your life so much easier. But this being the modern DIY, low barrier to entry, without using hand tools that takes forever, this is what we're doing. You'll see that I'm sanding this here. I'm just using a 60 grit pad to get some of the marks out from the mill so I can see what it's going to look like when it's all said and done. And then we're going to move on to a first coat of finish. The finish that I like to use for most of my projects that I'm doing for myself is 100% tung oil, mixed 50-50 with a thinner of some sort. I go in more depth in my previous video, but that's what I'm using here. And we're just trying to get it deep into the wood to penetrate and show us what we're working with. Now, with the burl section is going to absorb a lot more oil than the straight grain portion. So just be prepared. You can really soak that in and not be afraid to oversaturate it because it'll suck right in with the end grain sticking up. Now, as we're rounding third base here, you can see that this wood is taking on a much darker appearance than other types of maple might because of this burl and figuring. So we're going to work with that, do some black epoxy, and on that note, I will see